8:49 will be our first song, then 8:74 for those at the back, and then 8:69.
Huh?
Talking too fast.
Say it again.
8:49, then 8:74, then 8:69.
6 what?
Okay.
869.
And that information is free. I'll repeat it if I have to. 8:49. I should have gave it to you when I come in. One more thing that I forgot to mention is we spent the last couple of days at MD Anderson, and Teresa had all her checkups, or most of them, and everything's good. So we're happy about that. Thank you for 149. It's a good song to get our minds right, maybe for what we're about to do for the next hours. It's a blessed hour of prayer when our hearts slowly bend and we gather to Jesus, our Savior and friend. If we come to Him in faith, His protection to share, what a balm for the weary. Oh, how sweet to be there. Blessed hour of prayer, blessed hour of prayer. What a balm for the weary. Oh, how sweet to be there. It's the blessed hour of prayer when the Savior draws near with a tender compassion. It's children to hear when He tells us we may cast at His feet every care. What a balm for the weary. Oh, how sweet to be there. Blessed hour of prayer, blessed hour of prayer. What a balm for the weary. Oh, how sweet to be there. At the blessed hour of prayer, trusting and we believe that the blessing we're needing we'll surely receive. In the fullness of this trust, we shall lose every care. What a balm for the weary. Oh, how sweet to be there. Blessed hour of prayer, blessed hour of prayer. What a balm for the weary. Oh, how sweet to be there. 874. 874. Walking alone at even, hearing the skies afar, bidding the darkness come to welcome each silver star. I have a great delight in the wonderful scenes above. God is fire and light, showing His truth and love. Oh, where I'm home with God, a place is forced to rest, sharing a sacred hope with Jesus and the blessed. Rest for a weary soul, once redeemed by the Savior's love. Where I'll be pure and whole and live with my God above. Sitting alone at even, dreaming the hours away, watching the shadows falling, now at the close of day. God in His mercy comes, with His word He is drawing near, spreading His love forced to rest, sharing the safe abode with Jesus and the blessed. Rest for a weary soul, once redeemed by the Savior's love. Where I'll be pure and golden, live with my God above. Closing my eyes at even, thinking of heaven's grace. Longing to see my Lord, yes, seeing Him face to face. Trusting Him as my all, wheresoever my footsteps roll. Pleading with Him to guide me onto the Spirit's home. Oh, for with God, blessing is forced to rest, sharing a safe abode with Jesus and the blessed. Rest for a weary soul, once redeemed by the Savior's love. Where I'll be pure and golden, live with my God above. 869. 869. Come we that love the Lord, and let our joys be known. Join in a song with sweet accord. Join in a song with sweet accord. And thus around the throne, and thus around the throne. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, beautiful city of God. Let those refuse to sing who never knew our God, but children of the heavenly King, but children of the heavenly King, may see their joys abroad, may see their joys abroad. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. The hill of Zion yields 1,000 sacred sweets. Before we reach the heavenly fields, before we reach the heavenly fields, our walk the golden streets, our walk the golden streets. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Then let our joys abound and every tear be dried. We're marching through Emmanuel's ground. We're marching through Emmanuel's ground. To terror for on high, to terror on high. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God.
Got stuck trying to train it. One day I'm gonna walk up here, that thing's gonna make my eyes cross and they're gonna stick. Paul, that you last remember? You don't hear me? Okay, everybody wait. Huh? You done? I don't know. I'm kind of a little leery here. I'm waiting for the shot. So what I said was, where were y'all, or where do y'all remember us leaving Paul?
The liquor room. Somewhere in the liquor room.
Okay, well, no, actually, we had got through a liquor room and got to car rental. And now we're going to Jerusalem. It's interesting when you look at Paul's third missionary journey. What's the most that Luke writes about?
Trip home.
Well, yes and no. Okay? But there's a place that he writes about going to and staying. And then on the way home, he writes a lot about it too. Ephesus. And it's interesting, because once we get to that point, and this is the thing that we need to realize, we know he spent, from last week, 3 months in Greece, in Corinth mainly, and resided there 3 months, and from there he writes the letter to Galatia, the letter to Romans, and then he moves to Macedonia. And there he writes, I got it backwards. He went to Macedonia, wrote 2 Corinthians, then he goes and writes at Corinth, Romans, and Galatians, that we believe. Now, from that point on, it's kind of like, boom, 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 let's skip it. It's kind of like, you ever take a road trip and you have a little few incidences that things happen, so Luke kind of mentions some minor things, and then just some places, and then he went to here, then went to there, then boom. Then he stops and says, okay, here's something important. And that's kind of what he does from this point on in Jerusalem. Now, when he writes Romans 15, verse 25 26, we read, but now I'm going to Jerusalem to minister to the saints, for it pleased those from Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor among the saints who are in Jerusalem. So here he's mentioned, I'm leaving now. I'm going there. I'm not going to Rome yet. I got to go back to Jerusalem, and it's for the purpose to take this contribution. But he had planned to go one way, and the Jews kind of changed that. In Acts 20, verses 2 to 3, we see, now when he had gone to the region and encouraged them with many words, he came to Greece and stayed 3 months. And when the Jews plotted against him as he was about to sail to Syria, he decided to return from Macedonia. What was the plot?
Either capture or kill.
Either capture or kill, and I guess, his thought was, I don't want to be on a boat.
It's a shame if a boat went down in the middle of the water.
If a boat went down in the middle of the water. Then I'm more thinking about him going and the boat keep going.
That's possible.
That was kind of my thought. Maybe they planned to do away with him, cast him in the deep. So what we have here is he's at Corinth, and he's going up toward Philippi. He's going to Macedonia, where Philippi is. And how do we know he went to Philippi?
Luke writes in verse 6 that we sailed away from Philippi.
Luke tells us he does. So I kind of included this one up there. Wanted to point up, if you see Corinth over there in the left corner, and notice that they could have easily sailed straight down to Syria, down where Antioch is, over here on the point, with the, stopping probably in Patmos or Rhodes, and then Cyprus, along that way, bypassed a lot of where he stopped at. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because though it was a Jewish plot, this is one of those providential things. God had protected him from the Jews even on the boat. Certainly. But we wouldn't have the things that were being taught and that we learned if he had not went through Macedonia to Philippi, to Troas and Miletus and the other areas, because it would have just been more of a straight shot. So that's the point that I wanted to make of this, make us think about that. Sometimes we see direct operation of the Holy Spirit in a way that it tells us the Spirit is working, like when it tells us that the Spirit prevented them from preaching in Asia in the second missionary journey, and they got the vision to go to Macedonia. But here is more of that operation with a providential unit as we look at it, not a miraculous way, just coming into a knowledge. And so that's one point. Now, verse 4 gives us his companions. And there's an interesting thing here. This is why many believe that Luke stayed about 4 years in Philippi, from the second missionary journey to now. Because in the second missionary journey, in chapter 16, we read he switches from that personal pronoun to that third person pronoun, from we to they. And here he brings it back. And notice, and Sophocles Berea accompanied him to Asia, also Aristarchus and Secundus of the Thessalonians, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy and Tychicus, and Trophonius of Asia. These men going ahead waited for us at Troas. Who's us? Yeah, at least Luke and Paul. And whoever else was in that part of the party. So it's an interesting point. So they went ahead to Troas and waited. But notice, but we sailed away from Philippi after the 5 days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. Now, there's an interesting point there. Why 5 days of unleavened bread?
She got to Philippi later.
Well, yeah, 5 days, but after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days join them correct. So that I'm probably misreading that. The 5 days is probably after the days of unleavened bread. What was significant about the days of unleavened bread? What was that tied to?
The old Jewish law.
Yeah, the old Jewish law, but what in particular was that tied to?
Passover.
Passover. Passover. Okay?
The Lord's Supper.
Well, the Lord's Supper, but they didn't, we don't have as you check. Huh?
For the Jews, it would have been.
Well, we're fixing to get in that because that would be separate. The Passover was only kept how many times a year? Once. When's the Lord's Supper? First day every week. We'll get that a little bit more in a moment. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because that it's going to tie in later with something. Because
I'm sorry, how often were the days of unleavened bread? Was that once a year?
once a year.
Okay.
That they were prior to the Passover feast. Okay? So you had that unleavened bread, that's all they had was unleavened bread and wine. And that unleavened bread was made with bitter herbs. They do that for about a week before the Passover. So just as a reminder of how bad things were in Egypt.
That had happened the week before Christ's crucifixion.
Yeah, it happened the week before Christ's crucifixion. And it many times was mentioned as part of the Passover.
They're tied together.
Yeah, they were tied together, and so that aspect of it. So when we look at this and we see it, there comes a question, what's Paul doing? Are they keeping this feast?
Observing the traditions of his fathers.
Observing the tradition of his fathers. That becomes important because when you start reading his writings before his imprisonment and comparing them to the ones after his imprisonment, before his imprisonment, he's like, well, if you're a Jew and you want to keep them, keep them. Just don't find it on the Gentile. After his imprisonment, he's kind of more of a face. You don't have to worry about these anymore. He has his own concern with them, even though, you know, it would seem that they kept those, or it's just giving us a timeline. If they kept those when they're at Philippi, did it as a personal thing rather than keep them. The thing of the law was the Feast of the Unleavened Bread could be kept anywhere. What about the Passover?
Only in Jerusalem.
Only in Jerusalem. Which I think is why it mentions unleavened bread and not in Jerusalem. It gives us that time frame too. So during that 7 days, if you notice, the only one that we know of that is Jewish that went ahead to Troas during that 12 days is Timothy, and he's only half Jew. So it's obvious Paul wasn't binding up on the Jewish people to keep on there, but probably as a personal thing. And we see that. Okay? Now, tell them we stay 7 days. Why 7 days? That puts them back up there. Notice Philippi is there. And then Troas is down there with the yellow and the red meat. They're part of Myssa. Okay? Yeah. That gives an idea of the time frame that it takes of that time frame or that time to move. If you notice there, and that's by water. That's definitely the quickest way to get there. You look at the land, the coastline, look how you would have to go up there. Through the Ocean Way and then down and that. And so this was the quickest 5 days. Now, it might be that they may not have had a headwind or something, but still. Could you imagine 5 days on one of those kind of boats? Well, why did they wait 7 days at Troas? Waiting for the first day of the week. Notice now, on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together. We get people take things sometimes and strain at gnats. I remember years ago, a guy sit there and use this verse to say that the Lord's Supper had to be before the preacher. Okay? I've heard people say that the Lord's Supper is supposed to be taken in the upper room.
There's a church, I believe in Nashville or Memphis, that you can go and tour. It's an old building, old church. and they have an upper room.
Is it filled with many lamps?
I don't know about lamps, but you know why they tie that together to the upper room? Not just this verse, they tie it to another one.
The institution of the Lord's Supper was in an upper room.
But when the Lord established the Lord's Supper, it was in an upper room. So they got to see it's supposed to be in an upper room. Huh? Well, that was, but see that, and the thing of it is, you're right, they all ate in upper rooms, and the reason they did was because of the architecture of the time, and that point of where it was, that they used it to get away from people. And so it was a part of the culture, not to be established as part of the church. Paul?
I once preached for a congregation that did believe that things had to be in order, and it was here in Louisiana, not here, but somewhere.
Well, I mean, I've seen people that, and I've seen this from when I was a kid, the idea that you had to break the bread before you prayed. See, what it gets into is, and I understand we have a part of a ritual, but the ritual can't overshadow the spiritual. And we get too tied up into things, we start to miss the point. But by the same time, we can't neglect other things.
When somebody has the idea that it has to be in order, you know, you can get in trouble or if you don't do it that way, and, you know, they insist on their way.
Well, and you got that. You've had people get it into order. The idea of one cup, one loaf even. Huh?
No, it didn't.
I bet you it didn't. In some places, I bet you it didn't.
Well, one thing about back then too, what does the upper room not have that the bottom floor does?
Animals, dirt and animals.
Kids.
It was a clean place to eat. That was the thing about it. Again, culture, okay? Had to do with culture. Now,
The upper room,
what should we really pay attention here?
the upper room is the same, that was used for Jesus. There was no room in the inn. It was probably an upper room. A different word for inn.
Yeah, they had a different word there, and the more I read about what it meant was that often houses were set up with extra rooms for hospitality, and that was filled. And he wasn't out in a barn like we put him in. There was a part of the house, the lower part of the house, there was a section bit that housed the animals, so they just were put with the animals. And, and out west, and even in the south, it wasn't uncommon if a house was full of hospitality, let people stay in your barn. If they needed. So that's the thing there. Now, what should we really pay attention here to in this verse?
The purpose of coming together.
The purpose of coming together. What was the purpose? Break bread. Well, that's the only purpose.
They preached.
They preached.
There, but they did.
There's an interesting thing, and I'm going to tie this up because it's kind of what we're going to focus on is first day of the week. When they do it. That's important, is when. See, there's importance there because Luke says on the first day of the week. They do it any other day? How many days were they there?
7.
7 days. Which indicates that they stayed there waiting for them to come together. He wanted to meet with them. He had a message given to them. He wanted to meet with them. There was a set time. There's an interesting thing in 1 Corinthians 4:17. Paul says, "For this reason I have sent Timothy to you, who is my beloved and faithful son in the Lord, who will remind you of my ways in Christ as I teach everywhere in every church." So did Paul teach any church to do anything different that he taught at another church? Okay? From what we understand, who established the church in Troas? Paul did. Now
So he taught it the same as he taught everywhere.
taught everywhere else, first day of the week. Okay, now, here's the interesting part that I want you to understand. From where did Paul write 1 Corinthians, from our understanding? Ephesus. In that 3-year period that he was in Ephesus, somewhere in there he wrote that and had it delivered by Timothy. So this was prior to him now coming to Troas, right? Okay? So when he starts writing from Ephesus, he says, "Now in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse. For first of all, when you come together as a church, I hear there are divisions among you, in part I believe." So when he starts writing that about the Lord's Supper, what does he say? When you come together as a church. Church comes together to have the Lord's Supper. Okay? What else do they do? Now we look at Troas, we see that Paul preached.
Same.
They sang. How do we know they sang?
Different scriptures say it.
Okay? In this, when you start going through this discourse, 1 Corinthians 11, in chapter 12, he starts talking about their use of spiritual gifts, 12, 13, and 14. And he even makes a statement, how is it when you come together, each has a song, each has a prophecy, each has a prayer. He brings up all these things that they're doing. And he tells them to sing with the Spirit and to pray with the Spirit and understanding. And understanding goes together. Prophecy is prophesying a form of preaching. So they were singing, they were praying, they were preaching. Huh? And having communion. And in 1 Corinthians 6:15, he gives them a sermon on the resurrection, basically. And then in chapter 16, he starts, now notice this is important. "Now concerning the collections for the saints, as I've given orders to the church in places, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay aside some stored up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come." Why the first day of the week take up that offering?
We're all together.
They're already coming together on the first day of the week. So he ties it all together. All the avenues of worship are in there. They're all right there. We just don't always see it. And this was written before he went to Corinth, and that's going to be our Troas, and that's going to be just as important when we look at some other things. So this point here establishes that Corinth was coming together on the first day of the week, the same as Troas was coming together on the first day of the week. Just the same as Ephesus, Philippi, Thessalonica. Wherever there was a congregation, it was coming together on the first day of the week, and it took the Lord's Supper. Jerusalem, Rome. Because we know it why. Because Paul said, "What I've taught in one church, I taught in every church."
It's also backed up by secular history. Josephus writes about it, of them assembling in the catacombs of Rome on the first day of the week. And, there's lessons, or there's scripture, or not scripture, but there's writings about the Christians would assemble before daylight, and they could be heard singing in the catacombs. And they may come together later during the day to do communion or whatever, but because Monday was a work day, Sunday was a work day in the Roman Empire. It was not a day off.
And that was the thing, and they did it. So we have the secular history, but here we have it showing that Paul taught it. And that's why it followed on in the secular. There are secular history reports. So there's some other things that Paul taught. And we want to look at this, and I want to think about it. Saw a meme a few years ago that had people preach, somebody preaching, and people falling asleep in the pews, and a clock showing in the back, and it said there's a difference between being long-winded and taking hostages. And so, I'm not sure if Paul was just long-winded or if he was taking hostages that night. But he was doing what the Spirit moved him to do. Let me put it that way. Now notice, anyone knows that a certain young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep, he was overcome by sleep, and as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. Okay? That might be when we're on the ground. So that there is something that I'm not sure, other than the fact that the Lord is trying to teach us, you got to consider people. I think that part we need to understand. Paul had a message he had to deliver, but also sometimes we got to consider people. How much are they going to absorb? Some have criticized this young man for falling asleep, but I want us to think about something. What happened on the night of the Lord's betrayal? Apostles fell asleep 3 times. And what did he say? Spirit is willing, but the body is weak. A preacher may want to lesson needs to go for however long he thinks it does to complete it. But what happens when people start going? What's the good of the lesson then?
Maybe for the ones that are excited and need to hear it. So
Maybe. Okay, I'll tell you what. Let's just plan on Sunday. I'll preach till 2 o'clock. How you feel about
I'm just saying.
it? I understand. See, Ron's already got his hand up.
People must have been
I'm one
listening.
of the worst, but, one of the things that amazed me in China was that they stayed for 4 hours because an hour lesson through a translator and any questions back and like that, an hour lesson takes about 4 hours.
Right.
But they would stay for 4 hours. They'd sleep for about an hour during lunch, and they would stay for another 4 hours for a lesson in the afternoon.
Yeah.
So different places are different.
Different places
In
are
the
different.
United States, if you can keep their attention for 20 minutes, you're doing good.
Well, and there'll be times, that we do that, and I'm just saying on average, but like come January now, when I was in preaching school, and we had the lecture shifts, because what the students had to do, we'd get there about 7 o'clock in the morning, and we'd go home about 9 o'clock at night. And we'd only get to hear, we had 2 groups, we'd only get to hear half the lessons. Because things we had to do, like clean bathrooms and everything, keep all that done behind the scenes. And I'll tell you, by the end of that week, we were glad we didn't have to go to school on Friday. Because the last day of the lecture shift was Thursday. But I can tell you now, when I go down there, and I'm excited to hear it. I got friends down there. I hear a lot of friends speak. People I've never met before speak. But you go through there, you get 3 lessons in the morning from about 8:30 to 11:30. And with a little singing in between them and a break. And then you get the afternoon session where you have 3 speakers for about an hour and a half. Then you have a break, and then you have a question and answer for them on those lesson. So about 4:30 you get done and you break till dinner time. 6:30 they have the singing. 7 o'clock they start the first speaker, and the second speaker gets up about 7:45 to 8, runs to 8:30, 9 o'clock. Let me tell you something. That's the only guy. That guy that speaks last every night, he's the only guy that don't get told it's time to stop. Brian King will give you your 5 minutes warning. He'll get up there and get on the bench beside you. That's your 5-minute warning. To let you know you're running out of your time. But that last guy, he can speak till he gets done, till he's done. But when I say all this, by the time you do that all week long, you're tired. And you're taking notes and trying to remember, okay, what was said here, what was said here. So you're probably buying the book.
Did the early church in the United States meet every first day of the week, or did they meet sometimes only like once a month?
From what, when you go back church history, and we're probably going to stop here and pick up here next week. From church history, we find that denominationalism was here before the church, so to speak, restoration. And the denominations all met on the first day of the week. And because some of the things they did is what made people seek other things. I was telling Randy this one off about people make pledges and statements of faith. And Martin W. Stone, when he graduated from the Presbyterian Seminary, was supposed to take this oath, basically an oath of allegiance, but make a statement of faith toward the teaching the Presbyterian faith and upholded it. And he says, I will uphold the Presbyterian faith so long as it doesn't contradict the Bible. And things that were said at that time made him start studying more. He already had questions. And they just started making him study more. But yeah, the early church, as it was established here, and sometimes whole congregations of different denominations, preachers come in there and realize things were wrong, and these are people that preached there before. And when they realized started changing, the whole congregation would end up on the majority of it. And so they would still meet on that first day of the week. As far as taking bread, two things here. As far as taking the Lord's Supper, that's what made Thomas Campbell question, because he was told he couldn't give the Lord's Supper to anyone that wasn't a Presbyterian. And the Presbyterian church was the only one in that place. Then you also had what was called circuit preachers.
Yeah, see, that's what I was thinking about, because the farther west that you got, and I had a friend that said, when he was young, this is right in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early, every church had elders, but almost none of the churches had a preacher. Right. So they only listened to preaching once a month when the circuit preacher would come around.
But they would do everything else.
Yeah.
They just wouldn't have preaching except for when that circuit preacher made the circuit. So that was the other thing that I was going to bring up. And so you did that, kind of had that point that went on. And so, but they did make sure they did the other things, because in their mind, they could do those without a preacher. They kind of had a superstition that the preacher had to be a preacher to preach. That had to be the only thing he did was preach and later. And it's also the way that, have you ever heard preacher's favorite dinner is chicken? Fried chicken. It's the gospel bird. Yeah.
Chick-fil-A says so.
Chick-fil-A says so. Huh?
So then why aren't they open on Sundays?
Because they believe their employees should be able to go to worship.
But what about preachers?
Well, they have to get their chicken later. The thing of it is, and get that point, oftentimes the preacher was paid in chickens. Or if he was invited home for dinner with somebody, they cooked chicken. My daddy used to tell the only time they had chicken, there was only 2 times they would have chicken. If a hen quit laying, she got cooked. Okay? Or if the preacher was invited to come eat with them, they'd get a chicken. And he said he could remember my grandmother telling him, you go out there and find the oldest hen. Why the oldest hen?
Quit laying.
Because it's about to quit laying. And said never, ever did they eat the rooster. Even if it died, they didn't eat it because it was just so old. A tough old birdie. He said he did remember my Aunt Jenny, my great aunt, taking her rooster when he died and boiling him for 3 or 4 hours to put in dumplings.
Ooh.
But they weren't going to fry.
Ooh.
So, huh?
Sounds like
I mean, that's,
serve that here, Governor.
yeah, well, I mean, the thing of it is, I mean, the reality came back, you know, when you grew up in the Depression as they did, and that's the only time, I mean, you didn't eat something that was producing food. And those hens that were producing eggs, you weren't going to eat. At the same time, you didn't feed something that wasn't worth its upkeep.
The dog better go chase something.
Huh?
A dog better chase a rabbit or a bird.
They better do something about it. My daddy never had a dog growing up. I remember him saying that there was a cat that used to hang around. He only got to hang around because he'd go catch the mice. That was it. What's your invitation song?
909.
909. Is that a challenge for you? Okay. Yeah, we're gonna stop there. That's the end of the time, and we'll back up with you just because there's some things I want to point out in that time that we'll call in too. So we'll pick up there in 2 weeks. Next week's the boys are going to do a singing night, and so encourage you to be here to help support, encourage them, and those things. Let's stand and sing.
There's a fountain free just for you and me. Let us sing so grace to spring. It's a fountain from the source of love, and He bids us all freely drink. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? It's for you and me. Thirsty soul, hear the welcome call. It's a fountain open for all. There's a living stream with a crystal gleam from the throne of life. Now it flows. While the waters roll, let the weary soul hear the call that forth freely grows. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? It's for you and me. Thirsty soul, hear the welcome call. It's a fountain open for all. There's a rock that's left and no soul is left. Every heart is pure water share. It's for you and me, and its stream I see. Let us hasten joyfully there. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? It's for you and me, thirsty soul, hear the well.
bronze.